Conceptual artist and educator John Baldessari once said, "When I think I'm teaching, I'm probably not. And when I don't think I'm teaching, I probably am."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I discuss whether bone marrow transplants can change our genetic makeup, the biological effects of Wi-Fi, and I address our expectations of A&P course prerequisites. Not long ago, listener Leslie Walker mentioned to me a recent story you may have seen or heard by now. Or maybe you've just seen some version of the headline that there's this guy whose DNA has changed to that of his bone marrow donor. Not just that, even the DNA in his semen has changed to that of his tissue donor, who happens to live on a different continent. Yikes, what kind of world do we live in now? I go to the clinic, get what's by now a somewhat routine medical procedure, and I walk out a changed man. A changed man with a changed genetic makeup. I can see my Ancestry.com DNA story updating with another bizarre shift right now in my mind's eye. The thing is, how much of these headlines actually holds up when we, read the article? Or in this case, go beyond the briefer articles to the more substantively documented reports? Well, what happens is that the headlines are true, sorta. Yeah, they're kinda true, but true in the way that headlines often are. That is, by exaggerating the hook to get you to stop and read the article. And maybe click on some ads, right? I have links to a set of articles in the show notes and the episode page at theapprofessor.org/61. When you sort through them, you may eventually realize that, well, yeah, we already know that because bone marrow transplants introduce stem cells that proliferate new blood cells of various sorts that end up all over the body, and so we should expect to see a mix of recipient's DNA and the donor's DNA in the many places that blood travels. Whenever we have an organism that has DNA derived from two or more distinct zygotes, that mixed DNA organism, in this case a human, is called a chimera. And this condition can be called chimerism. We discussed the background of this term in the word dissection segment of the preview episode that precedes this full episode. So you might want to go back to Preview 61 to check that out. Chimerism is not a big deal as far as your health or identity or body structure and function, other than hopefully therapeutic effects of now having some healthy blood cells inside you taking over for those that had been causing you the problems that made you a candidate for the bone marrow transplant in the first place. Now, some people have questions about what happens if the donor is a different sex or a different skin color, or whatever they feel might threaten their identity. The answer is, it doesn't really matter. Usually. I guess if you had a skin graft that's a different color than the rest of your skin, yeah, that's a big deal. Or it could be a big deal. But these are not core changes to a person, just a helpful addition. What happened in this case, though, progressed over time to the point where the donor's DNA wasn't just in the blood, it was showing up all over the place. And in some places, only the donor's DNA was the DNA that was showing up. In other words, the recipient's DNA was not detectable in some places. Now that's kind of odd, but not totally unexpected. Now, one of the really weird things is that the guy's semen had only DNA from the donor. So, one might think, maybe this recipient could father children who inherit the donor's genetic makeup. Talk about playing games with your DNA story at Ancestry.com. Yikes! But looking at the case further, we see that's not likely to happen because the guy got a vasectomy and has no plans to father children. You see, the DNA in his semen isn't from sperm in the semen. It's from the white blood cells normally found in semen. This guy doesn't have any sperm in his semen because he made sure of that. And they checked. No sperm. But even if this guy hadn't had a vasectomy and had sperm in his semen, they would have his DNA, not the donor's DNA. Besides the fact that this story is good reading, because it both messes with your head and reinforces some important principles about our genome, this case is important in another way. It has the potential for messing up your favorite TV shows. You know, all those crime shows where DNA evidence is all important, and of course, it arrives on the detective's desk within hours of having collected it, just like in real life. Not. Okay, your favorite TV show is not really all that important, but forensic analysis is. It's important for finding and convicting criminals. It's important for exonerating innocent people. It's important in identifying crime victims and other deceased people, for identifying children separated from parents. It's important in getting your DNA story right when exploring your ancestry. It's important for a lot of reasons. So yeah, this case could open up a new path of understanding of all that stuff. And maybe in doing so, help us figure out how to avoid being too simplistic and maybe sometimes making the wrong assumptions. I think if the opportunity presented itself, this story could be the basis of a great case study in an A&P course, where you can ask students these questions of, could this donor father children through the recipient? And we know the answer to that because we just went through that, but maybe let the students figure that out. That, what are the possibilities here and, what are the mechanisms happening? Or maybe it would make a good class discussion, not necessarily a case study where, they're given the situation, they have to come up with the answers. Maybe they can do that in the form of a discussion as a big group or maybe in small groups. And no matter how you handle it, I think it could help a student better understand the human genome in this age of tissue transplants. A searchable transcript and a caption audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy, at anatomy.org. Did you know that AAA publishes a highly ranked journal called Anatomical Sciences Education? And it features evidence-based exchanges of ideas, opinions, innovations, and research on topics related to education in the anatomical sciences. Undergrad, graduate, and professional levels are all included, really. Just go to anatomy.org and check it out. Okay, just a brief heads up on the effects of Wi-Fi in the human body. The bottom line is, living a life immersed in fields of Wi-Fi signals has its hazards. I hesitate to mention them because, you're probably going to spend many of your waking hours moving through Wi-Fi coverage areas today. Even if you're commuting right now, that person a few feet away from you on the street or on that train carriage might have their hotspot cranked up and you're within their electromagnetic field or EMF. And so I almost feel like I'm about to tell you that the air you're breathing is going to kill you. Because Wi-Fi is all around us all the time in the culture that most of us live in. Now, hopefully, it's not really that bad, but it could be bad. In science, we know that we often run across some preliminary report about some discovery and then need to decide how much confidence we should have in the findings. First, was it a well-designed set of experiments? Second, has anyone else been able to replicate it? Has it been checked from different angles? For example, using other experimental approaches or technologies that confirm the original findings. Well, my friend, what I'm going to summarize for you right now is from a review article, meaning it's combining a lot of different studies and looking at them critically in terms of their value in supporting a valid conclusion. Actually, it's more of a review of reviews. So, in my mind, I'm thinking, this may not pan out in the long run, but it looks like I'm going to get a pretty well-informed perspective on this. It's published in the peer-reviewed journal called Environmental Research. Now, I'm not going to summarize the whole thing. It's a pretty long article. But here's some highlights worth mentioning in a calm voice to reduce any alarm you may have while listening. There are multiple effects that Wi-Fi and other EMFs have been repeatedly demonstrated to have in the human body. These are oxidative stress, sperm or testicular damage resulting in infertility, neural effects including changes to the EEG, changes in prenatal neural development, decreases in certain types of learning and thinking, and changes in certain types of synaptic transmission, abnormal postnatal development, increased apoptosis and elevated apoptosis signaling, DNA damage, endocrine changes including shifts in catecholamine activity, pancreatic endocrine dysfunction, issues with prolactin, progesterone, and estrogen, decreased melatonin and sleep disruption, changes in microRNA expression, especially in the brain, calcium overload, disruption of tooth development, cardiovascular changes, including blood pressure effects and damage to red blood cells, stimulation of adipose stem cells. Wait a minute, stimulation of adipose stem cells? So now I'm wondering if that fat gain that I've noticed in myself, starting around the time I added a Wi-Fi extender to my network, is really just a coincidence. Okay, it's probably just a coincidence. Because that's a demonstrated effect of Wi-Fi, though, I guess I can't completely rule out any impact whatsoever, right? Yeah, I probably can rule it out. It's probably the French fries. By the way, the authors did find a study that claimed there were no effects caused by Wi-Fi, but they found this study to be deeply flawed. Darn it, I was kind of pinning my hopes on that one. Now, this review is pretty comprehensive, and it does explore the proposed mechanisms of how Wi-Fi fields can induce the observed changes. There's a link to the full paper in the show notes in the episode page at theapprofessor.org/61. But I will tell you that the authors give a lot of weight to the idea that the theory that all these effects trace back to the activation of voltage-gated calcium channels in cell membranes throughout the body. Now think about that for a minute. Isn't calcium signaling something we see working within many different mechanisms of the body? From endocrine and neural signaling to muscle contraction to, yikes, all kinds of things, right? I mention this review because I think it's fascinating, even if a bit worrisome. But also, I think this is something that could really motivate students. When I'm trying to get them to appreciate the role of calcium ions in signal transduction, their go-to stance sometimes is, why do we need this level of detail? Which always puzzles me because I don't really make them memorize the detailed pathways. So what they think is detail is really just kind of a surface description. I just point out some of the key principles of how they operate, including how often we see calcium ions and calcium channels being involved. This is one of those core concepts that I want them to keep track of in those running concept lists that I first mentioned back in episode 8, and in that online seminar that is available as a bonus in the free TAP app. So I'm thinking, this might make for a very productive discussion to bring up the idea of Wi-Fi disrupting calcium channels and ask students what mechanisms they've learned about that could be affected, and ask them what effects that might produce in the body. Or maybe give them a list of known or proposed effects of Wi-Fi and see if they can explain those based on what they've learned about calcium channels and calcium ions. even if we don't do any of that. This is a nice thing to keep in our back pocket and pull out the next time students complain that what we're expecting of them isn't relevant to them or to a current understanding of ordinary human health concerns. Support for this episode comes from ADInstruments, providers of Power Lab data acquisition systems, the LT online learning platform, and content for laboratory solutions in anatomy and physiology. If you're looking for a simple setup and high-quality data, you need to check out ADInstruments. And don't forget, ADInstruments is offering 10% off select solutions for listeners to the A&P Professor podcast. Yeah, that's right, 10% off, and this offer goes through March. Just go to their website at go.adinstruments.com/podcast, and then use their lab solution builder. And remember to mention this podcast on any web form in order to get your 10% off. That's go.adinstruments.com/podcast. A common and perennial conversation among A&P faculty is what prerequisites, if any, should be required for the A&P course. That is, should students have to pass a biology course or some other course, maybe chemistry or maybe even some flavor of English or algebra, before they can be expected to succeed in our anatomy and physiology course? Heck, I've thought about requiring a solid study skills course before a student gets into my A&P class. I think I'd rather they be able to make and use flashcards and make concept maps than to be able to solve quadratic equations, for example. The A&P course guidelines from the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, HAPS, suggest a whole list of required and recommended courses with a minimum grade of C. HAPS members can access the course guidelines at theapprofessor.org/HAPS, that's HAPS. But the HAPS guidelines are, intended as recommendations for programs that want to align well with the HAPS learning outcomes, which I've mentioned before in this podcast, specifically in episode 54, and for courses that want to have a high level of rigor in their program. In my mind, at least, these recommendations are not absolute requirements, and that's helpful. But when things are not strictly definitive, or when we have obstacles at our school for implementing anyone's list of recommended prerequisites, then we, meaning I, tend to still fret about things a bit, or sometimes fret a lot. Sure, any answer to the prerequisite question is going to depend on factors unique to that institution or to that program or department or course. Actually, there are even more considerations than those I just listed, but I'll circle back to some of those a little later. Even after we account for all those factors, the answer never seems to satisfy us, does it? At least not over the long term. We seem to always want to come back to it because no matter what our prerequisites are, or our previous decision not to have required prerequisites, we never seem to be fully satisfied that things are just right. Why? Because not all our students seem to transition easily into our course, and not all of them succeed, at least not at first. So a solution that always seems obvious to us is, maybe we should reconsider our prerequisite requirements. And it seems to me that this is a wheel that is continually reinvented over generations. And remember, I'm as old as an oak tree, and I've actually been around for generations. All that time paying attention to what we're doing with prerequisites. Because that's what we A&P teachers do, right? We ask each other about prerequisites, and we theorize about what's ideal. And it seems that no matter how much or how often we fiddle with our course prerequisites, that prerequisite situation we have just, never really works. I've come to the conclusion that it's not that prerequisite courses don't work. It's just that prerequisites never truly fulfill the expectations that we have for them. So that begs the question, how much should we expect students to remember from their prerequisites? My answer to what we should expect from prerequisites is this: nothing. Really. We should not expect anything. I know that seems like a negative, cynical answer, but I don't see it that way. I think it's realistic, and it's, kind of freeing in a way. If I'm not really expecting my students to really own the concept of ions or protein synthesis or chemical equilibria or what ATP is and what it does, then I'm free of expectations. And because of that, I won't fret about it, really. Now I smile the smile of a Buddha when I hear my colleagues fretting about the A&P prerequisite requirements. Or at least I like to think I'm doing that. Not only that, now I'm far less likely to be tempted to judge my colleagues teaching those prerequisite courses badly. And I'm less likely to be tempted to judge my students badly too. By not having any expectations of prior learning, we're all starting with a clean, fresh slate. What a great feeling! Now you might ask, why don't I expect students to remember anything useful from what they may have been exposed to in their prerequisite course or courses? Well, first off, I don't mean to imply that none of them know anything. I'm just saying that I've come to believe that it's just not realistic to assume that most of them remember everything. And that's kind of what we do, right? Expect them to know everything from their prerequisite courses. Why don't I expect that? Well, partly because we don't typically teach for the long term. Think about it. The classic way of teaching, an approach that I used myself for many years, is to prepare students for the next test and hope they all pass. For those that pass, they've learned at least 60% of what I wanted them to learn. Now think about that for a minute. That's just a little over half of what they ought to have mastered. And that's just for those who actually passed. For those who didn't pass that test, all is not lost. They can learn about 2/3 or so of what they ought to on the next test, and it might average out to a passing course grade, right? But let's say they're learning a solid 70% or so on average, a C grade. That means they've mastered, or at least become familiar with, a bit over 2/3 of the material for their unit test. But because they're not asked about it again until the end of the semester, it's going to disappear. Until the week before the exam, when it's going to be relearned, at least in part, for another week or two, and then lost again. That is, unless we excuse them from the exam because they've been doing well on the unit tests that measure short-term learning. Even those with solid long-term learning need refreshing. But let's say they were in a course that really did promote long-term learning. Let's say they had to master 85 to 90% of the concepts and that they were continually expected to retrieve that knowledge and demonstrate mastery on a test. Okay, they're still going to forget some of it, even if they mastered 100% of the concepts and then taught the prerequisite course, or maybe they taught all the prerequisite courses. They're still going to forget some of it. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. But of course, the more typical case is they're not that competent when they reach us. So again, Isn't it more practical, that is more useful, to just assume that they forgot all of it? The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction, the HAPI degree. I'm on the faculty of this program, and it's a lot like this podcast. For example, you hear a bit too much of my voice and my opinions, but you also get to interact with many other experienced and talented mentors and peer learners. You get to process what you learn about science and what you learn about teaching practice together as a cohort of supportive colleagues. Check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. The topic of required prerequisites got me on kind of a rant about how we can't really expect students to remember much of anything from a prereq course. I hope you stayed with me anyway, because now I'm ready to tell you the really good news about A&P prerequisites. Perhaps you remember that I mentioned layering or interleaving in the previous episode, that is episode 60. One way that can work is when you keep bringing back concepts that were learned in earlier experiences. That could be earlier experiences from that course, or it could be from learning experiences from a prerequisite course. And every time we re-encounter previously learned concepts that we're likely to have forgotten, we relearn it, probably more quickly this time, and in doing so, that strengthens our knowledge, and it also promotes our long-term retention of it. Each time we do that, encounter the need to retrieve that knowledge again, we strengthen our mastery. I really think that to learn A&P deeply, we need to go over it again and again and again. Then again. That's 4 agains, which is about as high as it gets on my scale. So for me, that means that it's good for me to accept that my students probably don't remember much from the prerequisite course or courses. But I also know that this is how we learn. That is, we learn, we forget, we relearn, we forget again, although probably not as much as we forgot the first time, and we relearn and we forget in a cycle that brings us closer and closer to full mastery. I'm not really sure when that cycle ends for A&P, because I've been at it for decades and I'm still not finished. I'm a lot further along than I was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but I'm still a student, not a master. And that's how I look at learners coming into my A&P course with their prerequisites. They're still in the process of mastering what they need. I'm meeting them at an early stage in their learning process. And I accept that being novices, they've not really mastered anything yet. At least not much, for many of them. Then the next question is this. If we can't expect many of our incoming A&P students to know much about those foundational concepts we really wanted them to know, what do we do? The first step, I think, is that we need to review foundational concepts, whether we have prerequisites or not. I'm not saying we need to do it all at the beginning of the course, but I do a lot of it at the beginning of the course, at least some of it. The first thing I do is give them a self-paced online test at the beginning of the course that reviews all those foundational concepts they should have learned in the prerequisite course. I call that Test 0, which I introduced way back in episode 24, which I'm now thinking I should have made a required prerequisite to listening to this episode. But you would have forgotten about it. So here it is. I'm reviewing something that maybe you learned about before, Kevin's Test 0 and what that does. If they really have mastered all that they were supposed to learn in the prerequisites, then Test 0 will take them hardly any time or mental effort, and they'll have had some retrieval practice to refresh their knowledge right at the start of A&P 1. But for those who forgot, probably most of my incoming students, they have time to get back up to speed. And if there are any concepts they never really did learn, they have time to get at least a little bit acquainted with them. And you know what? If they get stuck, I and their classmates can help them. But it's not just that independent review in the form of a test that they can attempt several times. I also quickly review some of those core ideas in the course, thus further refreshing and reinforcing knowledge. I admit I've gotten a bit of pushback from students when I do that. For example, I'll never forget a student talking to me at the end of the first week, and he asked if this was all going to be a repeat of general biology. Maybe he was in the wrong course, he wondered. I explained my strategy, and the student understood what I was doing, and he was okay with that. Now, even though that rarely happens, I mean very rarely happens, it still looms large in my mind, like any pushback does. Disproportionately large in my mind. Isn't that weird how I do that? Not give much thought to when my students are on board with my course design, but fret over the rare student who may not get what I'm doing, at least not right away. I don't know, maybe you do that too sometimes. But wait, that's not all. Remember that layering I was talking about? I'm going to keep on doing that, bringing back concepts again and again throughout AMP1 and continuing on into AMP2. And you know what? When I start AMP2, I'm not going to assume they remember everything from AMP1. So I'm going to have that test 0 again, and I'm going to keep on just layering stuff throughout AMP2. Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. And speaking of HAPS, I want to give a shout out to listener Kevin Patton, who mentioned this podcast in a recent post from the HAPS blog. He mentioned the annual episode that I do called Kevin's Unofficial Guide to the HAPS Annual Conference. The last one I did was episode 42, in anticipation of the 2019 conference in Portland. He mentioned that because he was going to be a first-timer there, that episode really helped him get the most out of the meeting. Not that one needs a guide to the HAPS conference, but it can kind of prime the pump a little bit and get you in the mood for a great meeting. Well, thanks a lot for that testimonial, Kevin. And you know what? I'm planning the next edition of my Unofficial Guide to the HAPS Annual Conference as we approach the 2020 conference in Ottawa, Ontario. And I'd love to include your questions, your advice or tips, and any of your stories from HAPS conferences that you might have and that you want to share. Any kind of story, really, even if it's silly, especially if it's silly. Just call the podcast hotline or send me an audio recording or written message. And remember, you can always find out details about the upcoming conferences at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. I've been chatting about required prerequisites in the AMP course, and I proposed that we shouldn't expect students to remember anything from any prerequisite courses they've taken. And that's okay, because that's how learning works, and when we know that, we just start there and make it all work for them. I'm saying that by laying aside that frustration with prerequisites, we can be both happier with our task and more effective. And now the question remains, what good are prerequisites? Should we even have them? And if so, what exactly should they be? Okay, that's more than one remaining question, I realize. But they are kind of all wrapped together. At least in my mind, they're a logical bundle of questions. So here's what I've come to believe. I think prerequisites are valuable. I don't think they have the magical qualities that we often believe they have. That is, they really don't give us any expectation that students coming into AMP will know any particular concept, or at least know it particularly well. Yeah, okay, there will always be that group of students in the front row who will. But I'm kind of thinking they'd know it all whether they met the prerequisite requirement or not. I've also come to believe that what prerequisites do give us are those initial layers of learning. Yeah, the learning is mostly forgotten, but it's mostly still there somewhere and just needs some more layers of refreshing and retrieval practice to bring it to full fruition. So, what is the perfect prerequisite for A&P? I don't think there's an answer for that. I think the HAPS guidelines offer some great help. But it really does depend on what you want to accomplish in your course. What kind of pre-learning will best support that? I think it also depends on some practical things. For example, is there room in your institution's curriculum to add a course or two without requiring that 2-year degree program to become a 2.5 or 3-year degree program? Or to extend that 4-year degree out to 4.5 or 5 years? Not just that, but can they really squeeze that prerequisite in before A&P in their semester by semester schedule? I think some sort of introduction of biological principles is useful, even if not absolutely necessary. But having a prior experience of them is much better than not having them, right? What I don't think is all that critical is exactly what form those prior experiences take. I have a feeling that each new generation of A&P teachers will continue to want to reinvent the A&P prerequisites in the earnest hope that we'll finally get this right. That's okay. Let them. You can't see me, but I'm smiling with that Buddha-like smile right now. While they're all fighting that fight, I think it far more productive for us to use our time and effort to learn how to make what prerequisite we do have work to its full capacity. That is to spend our time on taking our students just where they are when they reach us and design learning experiences for them that will bring them closer and closer and closer to mastery before they leave us. As I've been mentioning recently, as we wind up the second full year of the A&P Professor podcast, it's a good time for reflection. So I'm asking you for about 5 minutes of your time to fill out a survey. It's put together by a team of podcast analysts at PodTrack to see who's listening and to help figure out what's working and what's not. I'm asking you now to please take just a few minutes of your time to respond to the anonymous survey, because it's your experience as an individual listener that's important to me. Just go to the approfessor.org/survey. And as always, thanks for your support. If you're a regular listener, you already know that I always put links in the show notes and at the episode page at the approfessor.org/61 in case you want to further explore any ideas mentioned in this podcast, or if you want to visit our sponsors. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
If the seal on this episode is broken, please get immediate help from a veterinarian who specializes in marine mammal medicine. Support for this episode comes from the American Association for Anatomy, ADInstruments, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, and the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction.